Welcome to the Layman's Seminary. We're on part 8 now of how to aim for the ideal exegetical idea. If you don't know what an exegetical idea is, I encourage you to go back to previous videos, starting at the first one, and go from there. A basic definition is descriptive summary. But anyway, what I want to do here is a step that I've done in a previous video, but also to build upon it. So let me back up for a minute and talk about what we did in the last video. I talked about there's different gaps in interpretation: time gap, geography, cultural, language, literary, spiritual gap. And there may be other gaps you may come up with. And I came up with these basic questions that you can ask so that whenever you're describing or explaining the Bible world, to understand what it meant, these questions can be helpful. And these are just generic questions that came to my mind. So what I've done is I'm going to take these questions and I'm going to try to answer them in light of what we have in our passage. We'll come back up to that in a minute. So I've done a little bit of what's called phrasing, or as I explained before, the thought flow, laying it out. Things are indented. I have my action words, not saying they're verbs or participles or infinitives or any of that fancy grammar stuff, just what feels like an action word to me, to the average English reader. So I have those so that I can kind of get the flow of things. So then I come right here and the first question, time gap. What biblical age is our passage in? And so what I wrote here, and it's kind of helpful sometimes whenever you're doing this, is if you pretend like you're writing a commentary. That's not going to be as accurate as a commentary because you would have to do extensive study to actually write a commentary. But it's still helpful to think about yourself as if you're writing one. So our passage takes place after the church has been established, and probably before the church began becoming more Gentile than Jewish. It is the first book of the New Testament. Okay, so those are my thoughts about the time gap. Your thoughts may be different on that. Geography gap: are there events inside or outside the promised land? I said even though this occurs in the church age, the audience is scattered outside the land. And so I have two interpretive questions here. Is this a reference to a pre-church scattering or a scattering that occurred after the church began? Okay. The next one, culture gap. Is it Gentile or Jewish audience? And I say it's a Jewish audience because it says to the 12 tribes that are scattered abroad. Language gap. Is it Hebrew, Aramaic, or Greek? James is written in Greek, as is the New Testament books, but there are Hebrew ideas behind these Greek words. Literary gap. What type of genre is the writing? James is an epistle or a letter to a scattered group that includes proverbial literature and sayings similar to some that Jesus said. And that's just from the top of my mind, what's coming to my mind about that. Spiritual gap. Is it for a believer? Are they carnal or are they mature? I said, James seems to view his audience of Jewish Christians as immature, but perhaps thinking they are more mature than they really are. He tells them, in other words, they think they're more mature than they really are. He tells them things new Christians need to know. But the sin of the teachers and leaders of showing partiality shows the leaders can act immature. I therefore would say the audience is pretty carnal, but in a different sense than the Gentiles would be. In other words, a Jewish Christian audience is going to have a different trend or tendency to fall into particular types of sins than the Gentiles. And just as the Gentiles would have a unique batch of sins that they would probably fall into. And of course, there's similarities across the board because we all have sin natures. But so you can take those questions and you can repaste them and put them all together, and then you would end up with this right here, this whole paragraph describing or explaining a little bit about the background of the book or your passage. Now from that, I go and I look at my scripture again, this one that's up here, about blessed is the man who perseveres under trial. Let no one say when he's tempted by God, and that he's carried by his own lust, and also about the reward involved. So then I start thinking, okay, in light of what I feel is correct about the the questions that I answered in the book, how does that affect my understanding of this passage? And so my first paragraph is pretty long, but I said something like this. James begins with the Jewish concept of blessing. He even used a phrase typical of the Psalms. He introduced the blessed man as one who perseveres under trial. This statement ties back to the beginning of the book. The blessed one is the one that counts it all joy when going through these endurance and character building trials. James is exhorting them to be mature with this mature outlook that is a moment by moment decision. The trial these Jewish Christians were experiencing is scattered, perhaps implying that they did not have the support of the others like the Church of Jerusalem did. The reason a man is blessed is not just because he perseveres, but perseverance is an opportunity or qualification for him to be approved and rewarded with a crown exclusive to those who love God. After having given this exhortation, there's a warning given. Someone is or could say that the reason they are in sin is because of God, but God can't be tempted or tempt. In contrast to blaming God, the Jewish Christians should recognize that temptation comes because their own desires have carried them away and they have been enticed. And so what I wrote here is I said, in a scattered, isolated condition where support may be lacking, it makes sense that the leaders would be tempted to show partiality to those who could support the others. A person could even blame God for this, but while God gave the trials, he does not tempt them. Instead, another enemy is mentioned, evil and the enemy within the flesh. The world as an enemy is present as well, because the world is partial when money is tight. And so I kind of, narrowed it down a little bit more. And so I kind of, all right, I'm going to try to make my exegetical idea. I said James called the Jewish Christians to have a persevering attitude because they will be rewarded. Yet there was the potential of failure by trying to blame God. Okay, that's one way to put it. And so I tried at it again. I said, count it all joy means persevering in difficult trials rather than blaming God, realizing that the Christian has three enemies that seek to sabotage him. All right. And then I kind of got it down to this one-line statement right here. And it's got a little bit of alliteration in here as well. The blessed, so here's blessed, persevere with God in trials rather than blame God when tempted. Now, the stuff about the rewards, the stuff of all that other stuff, that could be in explaining that, but that's what I kind of narrow things down to. And so what we've seen from this video is that by recognizing that these gaps exist and trying to even come up with a preliminary tentative answer for this from your observations can help you make your summaries, your descriptive summaries, or your exegetical idea. In other words, this is a step closer to getting to the bridging all those gaps so that you're getting more accurate in explaining what the text is saying. In other words, we're getting closer to the aim of the exegetical idea. In the next video, I will go into additional steps that will help us to get a greater accuracy in doing this. So please subscribe if you haven't already. Share this with others. Hit the bell so that you can get updates. And let us know what you think about the content so that we can improve. God bless y'all.